Jim, when you're ready, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, anytime you're ready.
Okay. Senator, the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, has said that there is nothing new in your proposal. What is your reaction to that?
Well, I think that really the major point consider is the changing climate over the period of the last 3 weeks, and specifically the statements that have been made by Premier Kosygin, Ho Chi Minh, and others, namely that they would come to the negotiating table if the United States would stop its bombing. Now, we've always proclaimed that we want to go to the negotiating table. That was our policy, that we want a negotiated settlement in Vietnam. A year ago, we stopped the bombing for 37 days in order to get to the negotiating table. All I'm suggesting now is to do what we did a year ago. In addition, the North Vietnamese, have withdrawn their original preconditions. They've withdrawn the precondition of the 4 points and the fact that the United States troops have to withdraw from South Vietnam. So we're in a far better position, and they say that they'll come to the negotiating table. It seems to me if we want to go to the negotiating table, we can get there now by taking the action of stopping the bombing in North Vietnam. Go to the negotiating table. If that's unsuccessful, then we can always return to the war. But it seems to me that it's at least worth that kind of an effort. And that is an entirely different situation than has existed any time in the past. It's peace, and peace with honor, and peace in meeting our commitments there. And it seems to me that this is the best opportunity for it. And as I say, all we have to do is to accept, really, the statements and the words that have been made by Mr. Kosygin, Mr. Pogorny, Ho Chi Minh, and others. And I don't understand. What puzzles me is why we won't accept them.
Senator, there was a good deal of a flurry of activity from the administration yesterday as you were making your speech, and some critics have said that that was an attempt to take the play away from you publicly.
Yes.
How do you feel about that?
Well, I think really the important thing is not a question of personalities or what happens in connection with an individual. I think it's important that we try to develop a program that will bring peace in Vietnam and still meet our commitments. And I made some suggestions yesterday. Others might have other suggestions or other ideas. But I think it's worthwhile for all of us to listen to various counsel and try to develop a policy for the United States government which is in our best interest and the best interests of world peace. That's the basis of my speech yesterday.
Senator Kennedy, you made a major speech this week on Vietnam. As you were making the speech, the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, said that this country had tried your proposals before. How do you feel about that?
Well, I don't think we have tried the proposals because what I suggested is that we accept the offer of Premier Kosygin in London 2 weeks ago, that the United States end its bombing and that North Vietnam would then come to the negotiating table. That offer has not been made in the past. There have been other signs over the period of the last 2 or 3 weeks that the North Vietnamese were willing to come to the negotiating table. Premier Kosygin made it quite explicit. I have suggested we accept that offer. A year ago, we paused in our bombing for 37 days, hoping there would be a similar kind of offer from the North Vietnamese or from the communists. There wasn't. Now there is. What concerns me is our failure to accept that offer, go to the negotiating table, find out if we can work out a negotiated settlement in Vietnam which protects our interests, protects the interests of the free people of Vietnam and the struggle that they are undertaking, and yet ends this very terrible war. And so I think it's a different situation, far different than it's been. All I suggest is that we do something now that we were willing to do a year ago, because we've had an offer from the other side that they're willing to negotiate.
Senator, while you were making the speech, there was a flurry of activity from the administration, and some critics said that it was an attempt to muffle you or to take the publicity play away from you. How do you feel about that?
Well, I don't think that's as important, and the personalities involved are of no importance compared to trying to find a peaceful answer to this war in Vietnam. I've made some suggestions. Others have made other suggestions, given other suggestions, and offered ideas. I think if we can find a solution to that struggle, we have stated as our public policy that we want a negotiated settlement. I think if we can find a negotiated settlement, and I made some suggestions which I think might lead to that I think that they should be considered on their merits, and that the personalities of all of us are of no importance and no significance.
Senator, do you think that perhaps the moment of truth got away from us, that during the Tet pause when Premier Kosygin was in London talking to Prime Minister Wilson and the bombing started just after he left, and Prime Minister Wilson said we were that close to peace and nothing happened?
Well, I think that was an important period of time. I don't think it's still lost because they have not retracted on the statements that they made that we stopped the bombing, that they will come to the negotiating table. I would like to see us go to the negotiating table because I think prolonging the war, escalating the war, making the war more far-reaching than it has been in the past is going to create tremendous burdens on us as a people and, of course, on the people of Vietnam. So I think that we should take the step with honor, realizing our principles and realizing our commitments there and realizing that we're going to have to maintain them, but to at least make this effort and show to our own people and show to the rest of the world that we're willing to take a step toward peace.
Do you have any underlying reason or any secret reason for thinking that the Soviets are sincere in this approach, this attempt to get us out of
what I
what
think
could
is
be a
they've
bad
made a
situation?
statement, a public statement, of what would happen, and I think that we lose nothing by accepting it. If they don't come to the negotiating table, or if they come to the negotiating table in bad faith, it's going to be exposed to the rest of the world. Our own position, our own moral position, and our own position in Southeast Asia will be that much strengthened for any kind of action we might have to take in the future. But more importantly is that we might find an answer to the struggle in Vietnam, an answer that comes from, in a way, other than war and other than killing people and being killed. And I think that's important, and that seems to me worthwhile. Ultimately, we're going to have to negotiate with them. Ultimately, we're going to have to sit down with them. We're going to have to work this out. They've made an offer. I think we should accept it. I don't think we lose anything by accepting it.
Senator, the United States started shelling North Vietnam from the sea and also using big guns to fire over the demilitarized zone into that country. Do you think that this escalation will harden their position any?
I think it's apt to make our problems more difficult.
There have been reports that perhaps this was just the prelude to a more aggressive policy by this country, in other words, a bigger bombing list.
Well, as I say, what I would like to see us do is, before we take those kind of steps, before the war escalates even further, that we try to find a peaceful solution to the struggle in Vietnam. Prior to the time of the bombing, there were only a few thousand, a handful of North Vietnamese soldiers in South Vietnam. Now the estimate is that there are 60, 70, 80,000, and there are 8,000 or so coming in each week. As the bombing has increased, the numbers of soldiers, of armed men from North Vietnam into South Vietnam has increased. This is steady escalation. I would like to see if we couldn't find an answer to this at the negotiating table, which is the stated governmental position, prior to the time that this next escalation takes place.
Senator, what would happen? What do you think we should do then if we would stop the bombing and the North Vietnamese would not come to the negotiating table? Do we then escalate farther? Or?
Well, I think we're going to have to consider our position. Obviously, if they use that period of time to try to change the balance in the South, then we're going to have to take other action. I think that has to be very carefully watched. And what I suggested is that we bring in international authority to patrol the borders between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, so not only our own people will know, but the world community will know what is happening. And if they use that period of time to greatly strengthen their position in the South, then, of course, we're going to have to take military action to meet it ourselves.
I think in your speech you mentioned that the UN might take up the function of patrolling the borders.
Yes.
Wouldn't that be a rather ambitious undertaking for the United Nations, which is practically broke now anyway?
Well, I pointed out again that they were willing to do that at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We found that technically it was feasible. Mr. U Thant accepted it. And I would like to see that the United States not be the only ones to carry this burden. The United Nations, members of the United Nations have criticized the United States position in Vietnam, have said things could be different. I think we should also put the burden on them. They can come in. We're willing to take some steps. Let them also be willing to take some steps so that we're not just, we carry the burden and they stand around and wait. So I think that some initiative should be shown in this area as well.
Okay.